Hello everybody and welcome back to the Contract Administration Practice Group. As most of you may know, we took the summer off and we are now getting back into the swing of things. And actually, I didn't realize we'd be doing a trilogy, but as Jim and Douglas sent me over today's topic for suspended projects, realized that it fit in line with our previous sessions we've done on delays as well as terminations. So I guess this is now the last of a trilogy of ways in which your project cannot be completed. With that, I do want to hand it over to Douglas and Jim to get started with today's topic. So Douglas and Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Welcome back, everyone. Glad to be back in the swing of things.
Yeah, it's good to be back. And Matthew, it's funny you made that crack about a jackhammer because there is some work going on right outside my office here. And so if I get some of that background noise, I'll try to mute the phone and let Doug take over more of the conversation. Right now it seems to be okay, so that's good. Welcome everybody back, and we're going to talk about suspended projects, and just will pose this as a question to start us off. Doug and I both have come very close to being involved with a project that was formally suspended in a fashion where suspension was the option taken rather than a termination. So if any of you that are participating have had a project that was formally suspended, please raise your hand for Matthew to recognize you, and if you feel comfortable doing so, share with us a little bit about what that was like and what your experience was. And you can jump in here anywhere you want to. It's no problem. We'll be quiet and give you the platform. So we're going to talk about suspended projects. Matthew, let's show on the next slide. We're not talking about this kind, but something that's a little more serious than that. So let's take a look at the next slide, and what we have done so far, as Matthew said, is we've talked about terminations and what projects are like that are terminated. And basically, as we've talked about, those follow two different types. One is a termination for cause, like a default by one of the parties, which may result in a termination, and the other is for convenience, which is typically reserved just for the owner to do. So just as a review, we talked about those kind of terminations. And we also talked about delays, which most construction contracts have clauses for. They may be for different reasons, but how they are dealt with is pretty specifically spelled out, whether it's unanticipated weather, or perhaps maybe some material delivery impact, or some unanticipated and unforeseen conditions at a job site, like rock or other underground issues, or maybe even labor disputes, such as strikes that have caused a delay for a project. So those we've touched on before. Doug, is there anything you want to add to what we've previously discussed?
No, Jim, I don't have anything to add. Let's go ahead and jump into the meat of today's topic.
Okay. Well, so what we're going to talk about first is what is a suspension. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that happens, and then cover some ideas of what you do in case suspension is something that occurs on one of your projects. So let's look first, Matthew, at what is a suspension. And we'll go to the next slide. So as opposed to the topics that we've already covered, either termination or a delay, suspension is actually a contractually allowable delay. That is the way this particular firm has described a suspension. And this would occur, of course, during the course of the construction of a project. So it is a suspension of work clause in a contract, and actually as these attorneys define it, is really just a compensable delay or a compensatable delay that is actually addressed within the contract for the project. And I don't know, Doug, if there's anything else you want to talk about as a particular definition of suspension.
I think of it as kind of putting the project on pause. You're not stopping it where it's a termination where you're not coming back to it. It's kind of hitting the pause button and then coming back and hitting play later and starting back up again. That's kind of the way I look at it.
Well, that's right. And as we go to the next slide, what is it that may cause that project to reach a point where it has to be paused? Well, in recent times, many of us experienced a declining economy, which may cause a project that had been contracted to perhaps lose its funding. Companies that had undertaken work may have filed for bankruptcy, or in the process of losing work, as we did the research for this information, there were funding institutions that could no longer provide the funds for work that was underway to the borrowers. So it wasn't necessarily an issue that occurred within the borrower's control, but from the source from which she was receiving her project funds. So there may have been mergers or acquisitions that occurred in ownership. Perhaps the company didn't declare bankruptcy, but was going to be acquired and assimilated into another organization. or perhaps the borrowing firm was acquired, as may often happen with franchise kind of organizations. Sometimes there are also unforeseen conditions that can occur on the job site, which may cause the need for a suspension until other plans can be made. The discovery of underground issues such as rock or other types of soil conditions might require that a project be put on pause, as Doug described. There also may be labor disputes or strikes which are addressed, and I'd be interested to hear from anyone who's in attendance that works predominantly in areas where there are strong union representation. Doug and I don't have much of that in North Carolina, so that's one that we're not really accustomed to seeing very often here. There's also the opportunity of loss of material, and as I was describing to Doug before the call and to Matthew, my closest experience with a suspension was on a project where the project involved an extensive amount of storefront material that was lost in a traffic accident, a pretty bad accident where the actual material was involved in a fire, a vehicle fire, and so much of the storefront material was lost in that fire and had to be remade and reshipped at a later time in the project. So that one came very close to being suspended in order for the materials to be received. It was a situation that the owner had the time. The delivery of the project wasn't so critical that they couldn't pause in order for the materials to come back. So in that case, that we were able to wait. But there was no formal suspension issue. But so sometimes it happens through the loss of material. And another possibility is the authorities having jurisdiction may issue some sort of a stoppage because of perhaps violations that they found on the job, or maybe suspensions are in order if there's been some injury on the project to allow for investigations or inspections, particularly if there's been a job site death. So these are some of the issues that we found during the discovery of what might cause a suspension. Matthew, I'll stop for a second, and Doug, anything that you want to add here, or perhaps if there's anyone that has any other ideas or any hands raised.
I'll share a story here that I worked on that I guess you could say was suspended. It wasn't for a significant amount of time, though. We were doing a church building, and the church owned the property, and to expand and build a larger sanctuary, what they decided they were going to do was relocate the cemetery that was adjacent to the church. And went through the proper steps of notifying family and getting permission and contacting the state, and had a company that specialized in relocating cemeteries come in and exhume all of the graves and place them in another location. So the contractor was out and started excavating for footings. And I'm in my office and I get a phone call from it, and I can hear in his voice that his voice is shaky, and he's telling me, "Doug, you got to come down here." And I'm just, "Calm down, what's going on?" He says, "I hit a casket, I was digging with my backhoe, and I pulled the top off of it." And I kind of paused and I thought, well, what does he want me to come down to the site for? I can't do anything. You got to come down. What you need to do is just cover it back up. Let me get in touch with the owner. He'll get in touch with his contractor that he had relocating the graves, and they'll come out and they'll have to dig that one up and move it as well. So he did. He paused work in that case. It was a matter of a couple of days, so it wasn't a long suspension. I don't know that the owner actually sent any documentation out saying the work is suspended. But that is a story that I thought I would share of an experience. That's one of these unforeseen conditions that can happen on site, where whether it's, in this case, finding a grave that should have been relocated that wasn't marked, or I've heard stories of where folks are digging footings for new excavations, that they find something where they need to get anthropologists in and look at and examine and make sure that they're not disturbing any kind of sacred graveyards, or they find artifacts or any host of things. So that was my story of an experience I had with an unforeseen condition that caused the work to be suspended, and again, it was only for a couple of days. So Matthew, I don't know if we have anyone on the webinar that has any experiences that they would like to share.
At this point, I have no questions that have come in, and I'm checking. I don't see any hands raised either.
Okay, well, let's go then, Matthew, to the next slide, and start to dive into what is it that we should do as a party to the contract for the project if suspension does occur. And I'll be honest with you, I was quite surprised myself. I guess I've always been focused on either delays because the projects that I have experience with have continued to move forward, or terminations where things were at a point that they just couldn't continue. And I had not really paid attention to the word suspension. And in fact, Doug suggested this as a subject matter, and I'm surprised at how often and frequently it is mentioned within the contract documents that many of us use all the time. And in fact, most construction contracts do have some sort of a provision for suspension. And they do this for reasons that we've just talked about of why a suspension may have to occur or need to occur. And these clauses are typically created to prevent the contractor from claiming a breach of contract. So, Doug, I love what you said about putting things on pause, because that makes the most sense to me out of how these provisions are contractually provided. So, with these clauses, it creates a scenario where the contractor cannot immediately say, okay, well, the owner now is in breach. They have abandoned the contract, and so now I have my full abilities to submit claims for additional costs associated with the project. In fact, these clauses do cover that suspension of work so that those things don't automatically happen like they may in a scenario in another part of the contract where, for example, the contractor could terminate the contract because of suspension of payment. And in fact, they go on to provide for the scenario where if the contractor refuses to go back to work once the issue causing the suspension has been overcome, that if they refuse to reinstate their services and perform based on the original contract documents, then they may be found in breach in some part. So by having these provisions for suspension, then the owner is somewhat protected from damages, but as we'll see in some of the contract language, the contractor may also be protected from some of those damages and have ways to be compensated in part for the occurrence of the suspension. Doug, is there anything you want to add contractually to that explanation there?
Not at this time, Jim. I think that kind of covers it. Let's move on to the next slides where we actually get into some of the contract terms from the different contracts.
Okay. All right. So what we'll do is talk about some of the typical contracts that we use, that many of us use, and I started with the general conditions of the AIA A201, where in Article 14 this issue of suspension is covered, and this would be suspension by the owner for convenience, for maybe some of these reasons that we've talked about. So the first provision is that the owner can, without cause, ask the contractor in writing to suspend, delay, or interrupt the work in whole or in part for a period of time that the owner determines. This pause that Doug talked about to get their feet back under them on a project. And here there's a provision for the contract sum and the contract time to be adjusted for an increase in cost and time that this suspension may cause, that this delay or this interruption of project momentum may cause. So within the AIA general conditions, there is the opportunity here for the contractor to receive a contract adjustment for this suspension. I didn't try to include all the items within Article 14 because they're too numerous to list here, but for the purpose of our conversation, there are more details in that article concerning the recovery of costs and how those may be carried forward. But I would say, again, in our research, that where those details would typically be expanded and where the additional information may come and is suggested to come would be within the supplementary general conditions, where you may describe in great detail what the contractor is allowed to do and not to do in the case of a suspension. And as we'll see in some of the other contract forms, there are more details that they include in their typical language, and we'll get into those in a few minutes. But I guess I would summarize what I'm saying, and then I'll hush, is that the suggestion is to expand in the supplementary general conditions to the level of detail that your owner feels comfortable and you feel comfortable to augment what is listed here in Article 14. Doug?
Yeah, Article 14, 3.3.1, the first one on the screen there, is pretty open-ended when it says that the owner can suspend for such a period of time as the owner may determine. That's as open-ended as you can get. If I were advising a contractor about this term in his contract, I would suggest that in the supplemental general conditions, as Jim proposed, that he may want to put some limitations on that and say that after, say, a 12-month period, then the contractor will have the right to terminate, so that the contractor's not on the lurch and just for an indefinite period of time where 5 years later he can get a call from the owner saying, oh, I want to start my project back up, and he may be up to his head in other work and not be able to mobilize and get back to that project. So again, the supplemental general conditions is a place to address those kind of concerns, and anytime to have a clause like this one, it's open-ended as it is, I would suggest that you do so. Jim, let's see if we have any questions before we move on.
Matthew, any questions out there?
It still looks to be pretty quiet on this end.
Okay.
Cool. Well, let's move forward to the next slide then. We'll take a look next at the AGC documents, document number 200, and the perspective from the General Contractors Association and how they view owner suspension. So here they describe, again, as Doug just pointed out, and I've got to tell you again, I was really surprised at how I guess open-ended is not quite the right word, because there is some closure language in this contract document, but you know, it says that the contractor will suspend or interrupt the performance on the work if the owner asks for that in writing for a period of time that is appropriate to what the owner's needs are. So it's pretty open-ended to begin. And this would be, of course, not associated with issues that may have been the contractor's fault or any of the contractor's entities, subcontractors, anyone falling within that contractual obligation. These are defined as items that are outside of any responsibility of the contractor. And if the owner says, for my convenience, we've got to suspend work, then the contractor will immediately do so. But then in the end, it does say that the price as well as the schedule shall be, not can be, but shall be equitably adjusted by change order for cost incurred of this suspension. So, as Doug was pointing out in of course, the AIA document leaning more towards the favor of the owner and the architect, the Association of General Contractors perhaps leaning more towards the contractor side to say, no, this will absolutely be an adjustment and it will be equitable. So there is that provision here in the document 200. Doug, is there anything you want to add to that about what might be additional language that would be helpful?
Again, I would suggest that maybe you put an outside limit on how long the owner can suspend the project. Such a period of time as may be determined to be appropriate for the convenience of the owner, again, is wide open. And for the contractor's protection, he may want to have some kind of outside limit, whether it be a year or 2 years or some such language.
I think this also, if we go back, you don't need to change the slide back, Matthew, but looking back at the AIA document, that these things that Doug's pointing out are opportunities to put in the supplementary general conditions. You may be able to suspend the project for a certain amount of time. Some projects that we have both been associated with, we, for example, agree on what the general conditions cost is of the contractor while they are on site. So it may be X number of thousands of dollars per day for them to be mobilized and on the project and have the appropriate personnel, etc. So there may be some provisions to say if the work had to be suspended, those costs would be reimbursed to the contractor, and they could be decided post-bidding, but perhaps prior to the start of construction. If there were something that you would have concern about a suspension, perhaps some knowledge of site issues or site conditions and that sort of thing. Matthew, if there are no questions, we can go on to the next slide. So, as you would expect with our engineering brethren, there is a little bit more specificity here that goes along with what Doug was suggesting and might be appropriate to add to the first two contractual documents that we've looked at. So the EJCDC documents, C700 in Article 15 talks about the suspension of work, and they also include termination in this same section. But this one goes on and starts very open-ended as well, that should the owner need the opportunity at any time without cause to suspend the work, they can do that with written notice to the contractor and to the engineer. But two things. They cannot do that for more than 90 consecutive days, and when they do this, they have to give a date of when the work will resume. So there's a fixed end date to the suspension. And the contractor agrees that they will restart the work on that date. It also says, as did the AGC document, that the contractor shall be granted an adjustment in the price or perhaps in the time, or both, that are associated with this suspension. And the contractor has to lay claim to those, either that price adjustment or time adjustment, as are described in previous paragraphs about delay of the project. So there here in this document is a defined period of time that suspension can be used as a definition to holding up on the work of the project. Doug, any comments?
No, as you said, Jim, this one does get rid of the open-endedness that we saw in the previous two. I think it's interesting here that it also requires that the owner provide a fixed date on which the work would be resumed. That might be tough if you're in the owner's shoes, you might not know when whatever the situation is that's causing you to suspend the project is going to be alleviated. So when you might not know when work will be able to start back. So I guess at that point you need to take a best guess. Not sure what would happen if you were to suspend for 90 days and have the date 90 days later and something happens or the condition is not relieved and work cannot start back. I would assume, not being that familiar with the EJCDC documents, I would assume that there's a provision in there that would cover that if that were to happen, then either party would be able to terminate the contract. But I would think that if you had a suspension at a point where you had a definite end date, and once you reach that end date, if the condition that caused the suspension was still in existence, that the parties could choose to terminate the contract, or if they so desired, could choose to extend the suspension for a further time period. So
Right.
Matthew, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I think you're right, Doug, that it further describes what that may turn into later in the articles beyond that 90-day period. But go ahead, Matthew. Let's see if there are any other comments. I want to ask, before we go any further, I want to share something with Doug and see what he thinks about this. But do we have any questions?
I still don't see any in the question box. Let me check for hands, and we do have one from Joe. So Joe, I'm going to unmute your line and see if you have the ability to speak here. So Joe, you are unmuted. Looks like Joe might be muted.
Okay, can you guys hear? Joe might be muted. Hello?
Oh.
Hello?
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Joe. Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So my question is, if the contractor is terminated, typically what ends up happening when the new contractor is being selected and they come to evaluate the project, then there's not enough money. So, what happens in those cases?
Doug, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at it. If that was the case and the contractor was terminated and you hired a new contractor, that's a whole host of issues. I believe we covered this when we did talk about terminations, but to try to hit on some of the issues and be brief, if there's not enough money, depending on the reason for the termination, would depend or determine what would happen in terms of how those funds would need to be made up. Or it could be that at that point the owner, if the owner was wrongful in terminating the contractor and the owner doesn't have recourse against the contractor, then the owner may have to get the project scaled back so he can comply with what monies he does have left. There could be bonding company issues involved where the contractor that was terminated was overpaid due to the fault of the owner or the architect, and now they're trying to get the bonding company to come in and take over the project. And if that's the case, then the bonding company's going to say, no, you guys overpaid him, and the owner's going to be on the short end of that deal. So there's a whole host of issues that could arise there, and a whole host of different scenarios and different outcomes that could take place. So I guess the word of caution is make sure if you are the architect and the owner that you don't overpay as you are approving payment applications as you go along, because if you overpay, and for some reason your contractor is not there to finish out the job, then you're going to be on the short end of the stick.
Yes, I'll add to that my own personal experience that you can very quickly become the target of the recovery of those funds if in fact you have overpaid for work in place. So Joe, your comment about it has been my experience most often. If you actually go beyond a suspension of work and move to termination with a contractor, that there are so many ways to show that it's going to cost more than the funds available to bring a new team in to get set up and get the project back on track. And so that can, as you described, put you in a deficit situation with the monies available. As Doug described, our job is very difficult to be sure that we don't overpay, unless you have a project contract that is a materials and labor, and you ask for documentation of everything for materials and timesheets for labor. It is very difficult to be dead on a number. But we are, and we've talked about this in previous discussions, in the state of North Carolina, I'm speaking of, we process an application for payment. We are signing that we are certifying that amount of construction is in place. That dollar value is on the site, either in place or properly stored. And so it is not a small, it's not a small step to take that pen out and execute your signature on that document when it's for, we'll say, a state agency. So it's a good point that you made, and it is a reason for us to be so cautious about when we go out to look at a site for a progress payment.
One last comment, Jim. Even if you were dead on with your payment applications, there's going to be additional costs when you get the new contractor. He's going to have mobilization costs that would not be in the budget or in the fees that were left from the original contract that are going to have to be paid. So even if you were, again, dead on with your pay apps and the work is in place and there's enough funds left to cover the work had the previous contractor completed it, there's going to be additional costs with bringing a new contractor on just in his mobilization, and maybe issues with bindings and getting the permit reissued in the contractor's names. There's those kind of soft costs that are out there that you can't penalize your current contractor for. So I could see where in probably most cases, if not all cases, when there was a termination, that the owner would be on the hook for some additional funds.
Well, there you go. Matthew, any other questions or hands raised?
We have two more questions here from the audience. One of them was just from Mohammed. He's wondering whether or not we're going to get to discussing remedies. So I just want to confirm with that if we were talking about that in today's session or not.
Well, with suspensions, the remedies would be for the contractor the additional contract time and additional contract sum that the contract already provides for. And that would just need to be negotiated and agreed to when the work is resumed. So in terms of remedy, I usually think of remedy in something someone recovers when they've been damaged or when there's a breach, but in a suspension it's kind of anticipated that the work is going to stop, and it's anticipated that there's going to be time and money given to the contractor for the delay. And so, in my mind, I don't necessarily see that as a remedy, but if that's what you're getting at with the question, is the contractor provides for time and money for the contractor, and that again is going to be negotiated. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis. If the work is delayed for a year, obviously the adjustment to the sum in time is going to be more than if it was for a week. If it's for a week, there may be no adjustment in terms of dollars and times. It could have been enough float in the contract, in the schedule, to where no time is granted and the duration is such a short duration that possibly no money was granted. So I guess that's my brief spiel on the remedies for suspension. Is kind of a case-by-case basis that the parties would need to negotiate and agree to based on the situation that they're faced with. Jim?
Well, I'll just add we do have one section here that we're going to touch on financial opportunity just within an AIA document. So that is, as Doug described it, a piece of remedy, or one of the remedies, albeit it's the financial piece. But what was the second question, Matthew? And then we'll move on to what I would define as a remedy.
All right. Well, we actually have another one popped in as well, so I'm going to combine them here.
Okay.
A good contractor has all of his profit in the first 3 pay-ups. So how do we define overpaid? And then a side question that came in from there that we also might be talking about is who would be monitoring the bonding issues as it relates to all of that stuff? I'm not sure if we cover that in the finance section or if we want to address that all now.
Well, I'll go first, Doug, and say I love the comment about a good contractor getting all his profit up front. And I've said that myself many times, but it's what we hope doesn't happen. And if you're able to require a breakdown of labor and materials within your schedule of values and your pay applications, perhaps you can keep all of it from happening in the first 3 months of the project. It's one of those friendly battles at the beginning of a job to get the schedule of values laid out, and often why I think in some instances, for example, some agencies require manpower loaded schedules so you can see a little bit more of the extended labor cost on a project to try to keep that from happening. But it is a valid concern that you raise, that early in the project, I've had a lot of contractors tell me by the time they build the steel erection, they had all their profit out of the project. So there's much to come after that. And to the issue of bonding companies, I err on the side of too much information. If I were involved with a project that moved to a formal suspension, I certainly would be communicating that with the bonding company, as I would expect the contractor to be doing with their bonding company, to let them know that this was occurring, and it definitely would be important to do if that suspension was related in any way to the financing for the job. That you would want them, the surety of the bonding company, involved and knowledgeable about what was happening. Doug, I'll stop there.
Jim, I agree with everything you said. As far as the schedule values goes, that's the place to address your concerns with the contractor, and front loading his schedule values and his payment. And I've even seen in some cases where you ask them to break out the profit as a separate line item. I guess if you're really concerned, or a contractor has a reputation, that might be something that you require in your documents, that he had this profit as a separate line item and he gets this profit as the project goes along, just like it would as the work progresses. So I agree with everything you said. So,
Matthew, any others?
Nope, at this point.
Before we go to the...
Yep, we can go on to the next slide here.
Okay. So there was a question about remedies. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And we took a look at one of the standard agreements, the B102 Architectural Services Agreement. And Article 5 talks about termination, but it also talks about suspension. And in this article, it puts the architect for the project a little bit in an opportunity to be in the driver's seat. It specifically ties termination or suspension here with payment in Article 5, and basically says that it is the architect's opportunity to decide at the architect's option whether, if in fact payment is not occurring on a job, that your services may be able to be terminated, or perhaps you want to suspend them. And if you choose to suspend them, you would give the owner a 7-day written notice that you are going to have to go to this measure. And if you do suspend your services under this article, then the owner is not holding you liable for delay or any damages that occur, because actually it's the owner's actions that have caused this suspension of services. Again, this is tied to non-payment while you're working on the job. And then, should you resume your services, the architect would be paid all the sums due prior to that suspension occurring, as well as any kind of expenses that this interruption has caused. You've moved on to other projects. Now you have to restart on this project, so there may be additional costs incurred because you went through this process. And then looking further down the road at services yet to come and the time on the schedule yet to come, you might have to have an equitable adjustment to future services as well. So there are 3 points in Article 5 that I'd like to just go over, and then we'll stop and ask questions. So all these are within Article 5. That's 5.1. Matthew, we may have to go back and forth between this slide and the next slide for the questions, but let's go ahead and look at the next slide. And Article 5.2 describes how the owner may suspend the project if they need to for any reason. If, though, they do that for more than 30 consecutive days, then the architect shall be compensated for services prior to that occurring, and are due those compensations within the agreement. And when the project is resumed, then the architect would be compensated for unavoidable expenses that have occurred during that interruption. So in this article, we see, as Doug pointed out earlier, putting some closure, some end dates, and some periods of time that are reasonable in the mind of the contract to have this suspension occur. And then again, should work resume, then the architect's fees and the schedule for the project, again, will be equitably adjusted. If, though, the owner suspends this project for 180 cumulative days for any reasons other than something that is the architect's doing, or the fault of the architect, then the architect can terminate their services with a 7-day written notice. So again, it's putting an end date to how long you as a practitioner could be expected to be on pause for a project. So those are the articles within the B102 document that specifically address the suspension of services. Doug, I want to give you a chance to add anything, and then we'll see if there are any questions between those last two slides that we've looked at.
Jim, I don't have anything to add. Again, if I were advising a contractor, just as this architect agreement has an hour limit, that I would suggest the contractor negotiate the same in his contract and get that put into the supplemental journal conditions. And to me, it would make sense for it to mirror the same terms that you have for your design professional. So, Matthew, are there any questions over these last couple of slides?
I am not seeing anything at the moment.
Okay.
You know, I would add here that I think as we have looked through these documents, one of the opportunities, and Doug, I'll be interested to see what you think about this, but you know, within your services agreement, having an opportunity to make modifications to that contract that are suitable to you, whether 180 days is a reasonable number or 60 is a reasonable number, looking at some of the other professional organizations, EJCC and the AGC, and seeing sort of bookends if they put within a schedule, a time frame, using all of that information to adjust your contract so that it is suitable to you, and also your general conditions for that matter for the project. Might be a really good undertaking and really advantageous to you as you run your practice. I don't know, Doug, what do you think about looking through documents and trying to build a consensus? You know, maybe that's what consensus docs do. I should have looked at those as a comparative, but I didn't do that.
Jim, I think you make a good point. If you have an owner that's using a contract that has a term in it that is not one that you want to make an adjustment to. If you look to the other standard form contracts that are used throughout the industry and they can reinforce your position, I think that would be a plus, a help to support your argument when you go to the owner and say, this is what you're asking, but if you look at AGC or CDC, the Joint Commission documents or whatever it is, this is what the industry is doing, then that can help bolster your position and your argument with the owner and getting him to change that term to match what's more closely industry standard.
Well, Matthew, do we have any other questions or hands raised? If not, we can.
Yeah, we do. We have a question that came in here from Joel. Joel is wondering, any thoughts about partial suspension? Perhaps one wing of a building is put on hold, but the other work can continue. Better to spend it all, then release part of the work, or take part out by change order?
I'll tell you what, in the scenario I shared, with that is what we did. The contractor, it was a big project, and they had sequenced the job to move from, let's say, north to south to finish and back out of the project. They switched that sequence when we lost that material and went south to north, and were able to not fully recover all the time, but were able to keep their primary subcontractors on the project. They didn't lose them to other jobs, which was really the big fear, and so they were able to overcome that issue. So, you know, I think looking at those possibilities, and as you said, Joel, moving folks around if that's a possibility and isn't too much to overcome, that's a good idea.
I agree. I think it'd be favorable to all parties if as much of the work could does continue. It just seems like that would be the best way to go, as opposed to saying, well, we've got this piece over here, so let's stop everything. If you can keep it going, I would think you'd want to keep it going.
All right, we have another question here. Just wanted confirmation or clarification, I guess, in 5.3 of the 100 days cumulative. Is there any clarification on what cumulative means in this, or is it just the overall, you add them up as you go along until the project is completed?
That's a really good question that I don't know the answer to.
My guess would be it would be consecutive days.
Yeah, it seems like...
I'm sorry, Jim. It would be 180 consecutive days. And they use the term cumulative, but in my mind, that's consecutive days. If for early on in a project you have a delay that's 30 days, and then you have another delay, and by I don't know, however far you're into it, you had 180 days. If it hasn't been consecutive, I'm not sure that would give rise for you to be able to terminate. But I can't say that definitively. You probably would have to look into court cases for that. Since it's not totally clear, again, that is a point that you may want to clarify when you're negotiating your terms with the owner on the contract, is have them put cumulative, consecutive, or consecutive cumulative days in there so that it's clear.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's a great question, and one of those, as Doug said, you could clarify. And interesting that the article right before it uses consecutive, but then changes to cumulative. I don't know. Good question.
We're getting close to the end of the time, so this one, I have a feeling you guys are not going to want to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If the GC has begun work and the owner is hesitant to continue utilizing the architect's services for under 6 months, but the architect is hesitant to move forward because of concerns regarding the GC and his work, can you terminate?
My question would be, can who terminate? Are we talking about the GC terminating, the contractor terminating, or the owner terminating? The owner, in both contracts, has clauses in there where he can terminate for convenience. So the owner can terminate the GC or the architect. The GC, I would think, could not terminate unless there was valid cause, which is typically the terms of this contract. And the architect, again, would need cause to be able to terminate. And I don't think the architect not liking the contractor, or the contractor not liking the architect rises to a valid cause for termination.
Okay, and the last thing is we just had a comment here. John Delfaro thinks that it might be cumulative in the sense that if you suspended twice for 90 days each time, and maybe then suspended again, much along those lines. But again, I think, like Douglas and Jim said, you may want to clarify that point in your contract before moving forward with the project. And with that, we have no additional questions, so I'm going to go to the next slide here since we are pretty much at the end of the hour.
Yes, please do. So our next gathering will be November the 24th. If anyone has ideas, suggestions for topics for us to discuss, or you'd like to participate, please let us know that. We'd love to have your ideas and have your input, and we appreciate you being here with us today, and I'll let Doug close us out. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending, and as Jim said, please, if you have suggestions for topics, send them our way. We would love to hear from you. Matthew, you can wrap us up.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim and Douglas, and welcome back, everybody, from the summer break and a little bit of the fall here. But like they said, look forward to seeing you in November. I am going to check with that date that may fall on Thanksgiving week again. That tends to be the case with where we normally meet as the fourth Tuesday of the month when we get to run November. And I'll work with Jim and Doug to confirm that date and any topics you guys send in before the next meeting. So look forward to that email from me. And if you need this recording for anything or want to share it with anybody else, reminder, you can find today's recording sometime, probably the end of this week or early next week, at youtube.com/CSIConstruction. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.